We have a stock market which some people use like a gambling parlor. And the transactions of the people who love the gambling parlor aspect of the business and those who want to make long-term investments to take care of their old age and so forth. I mean, you muddle it in one market and it goes out of control because the stock market becomes an ideal gambling parlor activity. I don't think that ought to have been allowed either. We don't need a stock market that liquid. What we're getting is wretched excess and danger for the country. And everybody loves it because it's like a bunch of people get drunk at a party. They're having so much fun getting drunk that they don't think about the consequences. It has bad consequences. You can argue that the wretched excesses of the 20s gave us the Great Depression and the Great Depression gave us Hitler. The idea of getting more value than you pay for, that's what investment is. If you want to be successful, you have to get more value than you pay for. And so it's never going to be obsolete. Now, you can get a whole body of people that don't even know what they're buying. They're just quotations on the ticker. Think of the past crazy booms and how they worked out. The South Seas bubble, the bubble in the late 20s, so on and so on. We've had this since the dawn of capitalism. We've had crazy bubbles. When you throw money, when you print money on the scale that modern nations are printing it, Japan, the United States, Europe, etc., we're getting into new territory in terms of size. The Japanese bought back not only a lot of their own debt, but a lot of their common stocks. So the Federal Reserve System, you can't imagine how much money printing Japan has done. And they haven't had all that much inflation, and it's still a very admirable civilization. In fact, you could argue that Japan is one of the more admirable civilizations in the whole world. And in spite of all this very extreme government money printing they've done, and they haven't had terrible consequences. Now they've had 25 years of stasis with living standards not improving very much. I don't think that came from their macroeconomic policies. I think that came from the rise of tough competition for their export powerhouse from China and Korea. At any rate, it's weird what's happening, and nobody knows for sure how it's going to work out. I think it's encouraging that Japan could print as much money as it has and remain as civilized and calm and admirable as it has. And so I hope to God the United States has similar happy outcome. But I think the Japanese are better adapted for stasis than we are. I think it's a duty-filled, civilized bunch of people, a lot of them older, not many young people, and they just suck it in and cope. In our country, we have terrible tensions. It's way harder to run a country which is not mono-ethnic like Japan. There's some professor at Harvard that has written extensively on this subject. It's way harder to run a nation like the United States with different ethnicities and groups and so forth than it is to run Japan. Japan is basically sort of a mono-ethnic civilization which is proud of its ethnicity, and of course they can cope with the troubles better than some other people can. We do know from what's happened in other nations, if you try and print too much money, it eventually causes terrible trouble. And we are closer to terrible trouble than we've been in the past, but it may still be a long way off. I certainly hope so. When Volcker, after the 70s, took the prime rate to 20% and the government was paying 15% on its government bonds, that was a horrible recession. Lasted a long time, caused a lot of agony. And I certainly hope we're not going there again. I think the conditions that allowed Volcker to do that without an interference from the politicians were very unusual. And I think in 2020 hindsight, it was a good thing that he did it. I would not predict that our modern politicians will be as willing to permit a new Volcker to get that tough with the economy and bring on that kind of a recession. So I think the new troubles are likely to be different from the old troubles. You may wish you had a Volcker-style recession instead of what you're going to get. The troubles that come to us could be worse than what Volcker was dealing with and harder to fix. Think of all the Latin American countries that print too much money. They get strongmen and so forth. That's what Plato said happened in the early Greek city-state democracies. one person, one vote, a lot of equality, and you get demagogues, and the demagogues lather out the population, and pretty soon you don't have your democracy anymore. I don't think that was a crazy idea on Plato's part. I think that accurately described what happened in Greece way back then, and it's happened again and again and again in Latin America. We don't want to go there. At least I don't. We've done something pretty extreme, and we don't know how bad the troubles will be, or whether we're going to be like Japan or something a lot worse. And what makes life interesting is we don't know how it's going to work out. I think we do know we're flirting with serious trouble. I think we also know that some of our earlier fears were overblown. Japan is still existing as a civilized nation, in spite of unbelievable excess by all former standards in terms of money printing. Think of how seductive it is. You have a bunch of interest-bearing debts, and you pay them off with checking accounts, which you're no longer paying interest. Think of how seductive that is for a bunch of legislators. You get rid of the interest payments, and the money supply goes up. It seems like heaven. And, of course, when things get that seductive, they're likely to be overused. And we know what happened in Germany when the Weimar Republic just kept printing money. The whole thing blew up, and that was a contributor to the rise of Hitler. So all this stuff is dangerous and serious, and we don't want to have a bunch of politicians just doing whatever is easy on the theory that it didn't hurt us last time, so we can double it and do it one more time, and then we double it again, and so forth. We know what happens on that everlasting doubling. You will have a very different government if you keep doing that enough. And so you're flirting with danger somewhere, unless there's some discipline in the process. But I don't regard Japan as in some terrible danger. They've done a huge amount of this and gotten by with it. I don't think we'll be as good at handling our problems as Japan is. If you're trying to do better than average, you're lucky if you have 4 things to buy. And to ask for 20 is really asking for egg in your beer. I would expect Microsoft and Apple and Alphabet to be strong 50 years from now. Really strong, still strong. If you'd asked me when I was young what was going to happen to the department stores that went broke, the newspapers which went broke, and so on, I wouldn't have predicted that either. So I think it's hard to predict how your world is going to change if you're going to talk about 70, 80, 90 years. Just think, imagine they wiped out the shareholders of General Motors, they wiped out the shareholders at Kodak. Who in the hell would have predicted that? This technological change can destroy a lot of people, and I think it's hard to predict for sure in advance. If you stop to think about it, what makes capitalism work is the fact that if you're an able-bodied young person, if you refuse to work, you suffer a fair amount of agony. And it's because of that agony that this whole economic system works. And so the only effective economies that we've had that brought us modernity and the prosperity we now have, they imposed a lot of hardship on young people who didn't want to work. You take away all the hardship and say you can stay home and get more than you'll get if you come to work. It's quite disruptive to an economic system like ours. The next time we do this, I don't think we ought to be quite so liberal. Capitalism is efficient when the people who are making the decisions are doing it about their own property instead of just as hired employees of some, say, state-owned enterprise. That's just the way it is. And it's just amazing to me how important it is to have a majority of the property of a civilization owned by somebody who's in charge of caring for it. That way the property is properly taken care of. When the Chinese went away from collectivist agriculture and let each peasant have his own plot of land and he got to keep the crop after his costs, the grain production went up 60% the first year. Now, who in the hell would want collectivist agriculture when it was that inefficient compared to capitalist agriculture? Well, the Chinese communists decided the hell with this communism when it comes to collectivist agriculture. They'd rather have the extra 60% in grain production. and they just changed the whole system. I greatly admire what they did. I think Deng Xiaoping is going to go down as one of the greatest leaders that any nation ever had, because he had to give up his own ideology to do something else that worked better. You don't see the Catholic cardinals suddenly deciding there's no afterlife. But that's what Deng Xiaoping did. He gave up his ideology, his communist ideology, in order to make the economy work better. And being an absolute ruler, he could arrange it. And he brought that whole nation out of poverty into prosperity and over the course of 30 years after he made the decision. That is a very admirable thing to have done. I've always believed that nothing was worth an infinite price. So at even an admirable place like Costco could get to a price where you would say that's too high. But I would argue that if I were investing money for some sovereign wealth fund or some pension fund, in a 30, 40, 50-year time horizon, I would buy Costco at the current price. I think it's that strong an enterprise and that admirable a place. I can't bring myself with my habits to pay these big prices, but I never even think about selling a share of Costco. We have a new bunch of emperors, and they're the people who vote the shares in the index funds. Maybe we can make Larry Fink and the people at Vanguard Pope. And all of a sudden, we've had this enormous transfer of voting power to these passive index funds. That is going to change the world. And I don't know what the consequences are going to be, but I predict it will not be good. Private equity buys things so they can have more fees by having more things under management. Of course, it's a lot easier to buy something you use somebody else's money. We're using our own money, or at least that's the way we think of it. The shareholders who are worried about the future because it looks complicated and difficult and they're hazard, I want to say to them what my old torts professor said to me. He'd say, "Charlie, tell me what your problem is and I'll try and make it more difficult for you." And he did me a favor by treating me that way. I'm just repeating his favor to you. When you're thinking the thoughts you're doing, at least you're thinking in the right direction. You're worried about the right things. All you people that are worried about the inflation and the future of the republic and so forth. I think some people are gifted enough that they can invest in hard-to-value, difficult things. Other people, I think, would be very wise to have more modest ambitions in terms of what they choose to deal with. So I think you have to figure out your level of skill or the level of skill your advisor has, and that should enter the equation. To everyone who finds the current investment climate hard and difficult and somewhat confusing, I would say welcome to adult life. And you're thinking the right way. Of course, it is hard. It's going to be way harder for the group that's graduating from college now, for them to get rich and stay rich and so forth. It's going to be way harder for them than it was for my generation. Think what it costs to own a house in a desirable neighborhood in a city like Los Angeles. And I think we'll probably end up with higher income taxes too, and so on. In my lifetime, 98 years, it was the ideal time to own a diversified portfolio of common stocks. And I'd say the people got maybe 10 or 11% if you did that very intelligently before inflation, and maybe 9%. That was a marvelous return. No other generation in the history of the world ever got returns like that. If you take the last 100 years, 1922 to 2022, most of modernity came in that 100 years. And in the previous 100 years, that got another big chunk of modernity. And before that, things were pretty much the same for the previous thousands of years. Life was pretty brutal and short and limited and what have you. No printing press, no air conditioning, no modern medicine. First, you got the steam engine, the steamship, the railroad, and a little bit of improvement in farming and a little bit of improvement in plumbing. That's what you got in the 100 years that ended in 1922. The next 100 years gave us widely distributed electricity, modern medicine, modern pharmaceuticals, the automobile, the airplane, the records, the movies, the air conditioning in the South. And think what a blessing it was. If you wanted 3 children, you had to have 6 because 3 died in infancy. That was our ancestors' Think of the agony of watching half your children die. It's amazing how much achievement there's been in civilization in these last 200 years, and most of it in the last 100 years. Now, the trouble with it is that the basic needs are pretty well filled. In the United States, the principal problem of the poor people is they're too fat. That is a very different place from what happened in the past. The past, they were on the edge of starving. And what happens is, it's really interesting, is with all this enormous increase in living standards and freedom and diminishment of racial inequities and all the huge progress that has come, people are less happy about the state of affairs than they were when things were way tougher. And that has a very simple explanation. The world is not driven by greed, it's driven by envy. The fact that everybody's 5 times better off than they used to be, they take it for granted. All they think about is somebody else having more now, and it's not fair that he should have it and they don't. That's the reason that God came down and told Moses that you couldn't envy your neighbor's wife or even his donkey. I mean, even the old Jews were having trouble with envy. And so it's built into the nature of things. It's weird for somebody my age, because I was in the middle of the Great Depression when the hardship was unbelievable. I was safer walking around Omaha in the evening than I am in my own neighborhood in Los Angeles after all this great wealth and so forth. So, and I have no way of doing anything about it. I can't change the fact that a lot of people are very unhappy and feel very abused after everything's improved by about 600%, because there's still somebody else who has more. I have conquered envy in my own life. I don't envy anybody. I don't give a damn what somebody else has. But other people are driven crazy by it. And other people play to the envy in order to advance their own political careers. And we have whole networks now that they want to pour gasoline on the flames of envy. I like the religion of the old Jews. I like the people who are against envy, not the people who are trying to profit from it. Yet everybody wants to have a pretentious expenditure, and that helps drive demand in our modern capitalist society. My advice to the young people is don't go there. The hell with the pretentious expenditure. I don't think there's much happiness in it. But it does drive the civilization we actually have. Drives the dissatisfaction. Steve Pinker of Harvard is one of our smart modern academics. He constantly points out how everything's gotten way better. But the general feeling about how fair it is has gotten way more hostile. And as it gets better and better, people are less and less satisfied. That is weird, but that's what's happened. If you have unreasonable demands on life, you're like a bird that's trying to destroy himself by bashing his wings on the edge of the cage, and you really can't get out of the cage. It's stupid. You want to have reasonable expectations and take life's results, good and bad as they happen, with a certain stoicism. There'll never be any shortage of good people in the world. All you got to do is think them out and get as many of them as possible into your life. Keep the rest of the hell out.